All right, so at this point in time, you should have your code editor open, and hopefully you have your emulator running as well with our default application on the screen. In this section, we're going to talk about some of our initial approach to handling all this API data fetching. We'll then start to write just a tiny bit of code, and we'll continue in the next section with really diving into it. So I first want to tell you what our overall strategy is for dealing with this incredible number of requests that are going to our API. So what you really have to understand here is that there's really no great way for us to mitigate the total number of initial requests that go out to that API. In other words, to fetch the list of top stories here, we have to make that request to get the initial set of IDs, and then we have to make a follow-up request for every single one to get some information about each particular story. There's no way to get around that unless we go with this type of approach where we put our own kind of middleman API inside of here. However, there are strategies that we can use to mitigate the performance impact of any additional or follow-up request that is made for the same stories at some point in the future. So let's talk about what we're going to do here. All right, so here's a diagram of what we're going to do. At some point in time, our application is going to decide that it needs to fetch an item from the Hacker News API. So that might be a particular comment, it might be a story, whatever it might be, our application is going to say, oh, I need to go and get something from the API. I need to get information about some item. So to handle all the requests to attempt to fetch some API, or excuse me, to fetch some item, you and I are going to make a class called the repository class. This is going to be a plain Dart class, so it's not a widget, it's not a block, it's nothing like that. It's just a plain class that's going to essentially moderate access to all the data inside of our application. Whenever our application decides to fetch some item, it's going to reach out to the repository class and it's going to say, hey, I need an item with like an ID of 10 or whatever it might be. The repository class is then going to turn around and it's going to try to access the two sources of data that you and I are going to create inside of our application. That's right, two sources. The first source that's going to be available inside of our application is something that we're going to call the News API Provider. So this class right here is going to be what is actually responsible for reaching out to the Hacker News API and requesting information about some particular item. On the other hand, we're going to have a second source of information inside of our app, called the News DB Provider. This DB Provider class right here is going to act like a cache of sorts. So anytime we fetch an item from the Hacker News API directly, we're going to take that item and we're going to give it back to our application and actually use it inside of our app. But at the same time, we're also going to take that item and we're going to cache it locally inside of a SQLite database that is stored on our device. So two sources of data, and that's how we're going to mitigate the total number of requests that are issued. This is not going to solve any problems or any issues that might come up with the initial fetching of data when our application first starts, because again, at the end of the day, we do have to make a lot of requests initially. But as long as we fetch an item at least one time, then we'll say, hey, you know what, we now have this, and we're going to hold on to that copy of the thing. And if we ever need to ask for an item with that particular ID again, we'll already have it ready to go inside that SQLite database. So to give you another take on how this is going to work, let's imagine that this is our application, or this is our mobile device, and inside of here is the flow of our application as it is trying to fetch some piece of data to show on the screen. So our application is going to start off up here, saying, okay, I need to get an item with ID of 10 or whatever ID it might be. So our application inside of that repository class, we're going to ask ourselves a question. We're going to say, hey, you know what? Have we ever fetched this item before? Like, have we ever gotten item with ID 10 previously? And so to figure out whether or not we have, we're going to reach out to that News DB provider, and the News DB provider is going to look into our local SQLite database stored on our device. And we're going to check to see if we already have ID 10 inside there. If we do, great, but let's assume that we don't have it inside there yet. So our DB provider is going to respond back, sorry, we've never fetched that before. If you want to get the item with ID 10, you need to actually go to the real API and fetch it from over there. So our application will say, nope, don't see it, we've never fetched it before. So we'll go on to our next step, which is to use our News API Provider class to reach out to the real Hacker News API, fetch the item that we're looking for, the item with ID 10, and we'll get that back as a response to our application. Then at the last step down here, our application will use that item that it just fetched from the API, but at the same time, our application is also going to hand that off to the DB provider. The DB provider is then going to take that item and store it in the SQLite database for future use. So that's the idea. That's the whole plan here. We're going to use the SQLite database to minimize the total number of requests that we have to make over the lifespan of our application. And again, for the second time to mention it right now, this is not going to really address any issues with the initial fetch of data. It's going to solve issues where a user is using our application a lot and ensure that we don't have to refetch the same data again and again and again. Now, another benefit of using a SQLite database for this is that that database is going to be persisted over restarts of our application. So if a user closes our application down, or if they restart their device, the data that we store inside this database right here is not going to disappear. So if a user then opens the application back up, they will already have a ton of items that they can immediately view on the screen without having to actually reach back out to the API to try to get that new list or that new item. So it's not a perfect solution, but it is a solution that's going to mitigate a lot of possible problems. Okay, so that's the overall goal. That's what we're going to try to do here. Now, the first thing that we're going to do inside this application, the way in which we're going to tackle it, is to build out this DB provider class and the News API provider class and the repository first. We're going to put all these things together, and then we're going to start working on the actual application. So with that in mind, let's flip on over to our code editor. We're going to install 2 packages that are going to allow us to create that SQLite database on the device. We'll do that right away so we can use them in the next section. So inside of my code editor, to install a dependency, I'm going to open up my pubspec.yaml file. I'm going to find the dependencies section right here, and then right underneath Cupertino icons, I'm going to add in a package called SQF. So notice the F inside there. There's an F. Lite, like so. So it's not SQLite, it's SQF Lite. And we're going to get version 0.10.0. And then we're going to get another package called Path Provider. And of course, we'll talk about what this is for in just a moment. And for this, we're going to get version 0.4.1, like so. Okay, so then I'll save this file. If you're using VS Code, you should see the Flutter packages get command automatically executed. If you're not using VS Code, or if you do not see this window appear, you can always flip back over to your terminal inside of the News project directory, and over here you can run Flutter packages git to make sure that you grab and install those packages. Okay, so let's take a quick pause right here. We're going to continue the next section, and we will get started with our API provider and our DB provider as well. So I'll see you in just a minute.